Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. Welcome to Ethical Perspectives in the News. My name is Pete Welch, and I'm the moderator for this morning's show. One of the things we've been reading about recently in newspapers is the infrastructure system that we have here in Iowa. And today we'd like to talk to some of our viewing public and give them some ideas about what's going on in eastern Iowa, Cedar Rapids, in this area generally, and how those things may have been addressed or have been talked with amongst our public officials. And this morning we have with us first Mitch McElree, who's the Executive Vice President here at Cedar Rapids Bank and Trust. Good morning.
Good morning.
And also with us is Catherine Cutler, who's with the Iowa Department of Transportation. Good morning, Catherine.
Good morning.
And lastly, we have Dave Elgin, who is the Director of the Cedar Rapids Public Works Department, and I believe also an engineer. Isn't that correct, Dave?
I'm also the city engineer for the city of Cedar Rapids.
Okay. When we talk about Iowa infrastructure, you know, everybody's been reading and hearing about things. What is infrastructure for our viewing public's knowledge generally? You know, Kathy, Dave, let's educate our viewing public this morning.
Well, I always like to say infrastructure are big things attached to the ground or in the ground. You know, in my arena, in the public works area, it's primarily mostly the roadways in the city and the sewer and water pipes under the ground, along with the buildings that house the city services.
I mostly do transportation, so my things are mostly the highways, the roads. I also work with the cities and with the counties on some of their projects.
Okay. And we've got you, Mitch, because one of the things we also wanted to talk about and educate with the viewing public today is how do we pay for these things? And you could provide us a little bit along those roads, you know, as far as roads. Dave, tell us a little bit about what we're doing on roads in Cedar Rapids, Lynn, and eastern Iowa, although I realize you're specifically tasked with Cedar Rapids.
Well, Cedar Rapids, and I'll focus mostly on Cedar Rapids, but, you know, the county and the state have similar challenges that Cedar Rapids has. We have over 600 miles of roadways within the corporate limits of Cedar Rapids. The average age of our roadway system is about 50 years old. A lot of older residential neighborhoods have streets that were put in when those neighborhoods were developed 50 or 60 years ago, and they still have the original streets. So the challenges that we have is to keep those roadways in good condition and in serviceable condition, keep them safe, and keep them matching the context of the neighborhoods and the quality of the neighborhoods.
Okay, now I personally grew up in Cedar Rapids in the 50s and 60s, right off of Mount Vernon Road, and I can remember all the way over to First Avenue, there were an awful lot of brick roads. And there's very few left there now. But one of the things that you do for the city is you coordinate, and your responsibility is city streets, but then there's also state streets that are designated highways. So Kathy, can you explain how you work with cities like Dave and how that relationship goes?
Sure. I think a couple most famous in the Cedar Rapids area are obviously I-380 when it was put through the area. And then First Avenue is co-jurisdiction. It's Iowa 922, US 151, and First Avenue, as most people know it. So we have a very close working relationship with the city, particularly on those shared jurisdiction roads.
And you now have a bigger piece of this for Iowa Transport is you're completing the Collins Road extension. Mm-hmm. And that, because that has a state designation, is that correct?
It does, yeah. That's Highway 100 that's being extended for 8 miles from where it currently ends at Edgewood Road. It'll eventually be completed down to a US 30. And that project's been in development for almost as long as I've been alive, so it's a long time.
And we actually have a deadline of 18, is that completion, or 19?
We're hoping the first portion will open, the first 4 miles down to the Covington area in 2018, and then the following 4 miles by 2020, fingers crossed.
Okay, since that's right in my neighborhood, I know that single lane of traffic going around at Collins can certainly be a choke point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's going to be that way for a while, so we're hoping people have at least grown accustomed to it. We're trying to work with people and get the word out about it, so it's going to be in place for probably close to another year.
Okay, so where do you get your funding sources, Dave, to do your work?
Well, there are really three primary sources of funding for our roadways in Cedar Rapids. The state gas tax. We get about $11 to $12 million a year from the Iowa Road Use Tax Fund as our share. We get federal gas tax through back from the federal government. That's the 18.4 cents a gallon we pay at the pump. It goes into the federal government. Federal government sends it back to the DOT. The DOT makes sure that people follow the rules, and we get it back through either grants, through working cooperatively with the DOT on the projects they fund, or we work through what's called the Quarter Metropolitan Planning Organization, where some of those federal dollars come back to the metro area, and then we utilize those areas for the whole metro area. And of course, we're the larger part of the metro area, so we get to use a lot of those dollars for roadway improvements there from the federal gas tax. So those are the three primary sources. Unfortunately, the city has had to rely on property tax revenues in the past, and then most recently the voters last November approved a local option sales tax, which gives us some additional revenues of about $18 to $20 million a year through that extra 1 penny on the sales tax to help with reconstructing our roads and bringing our roads up to good or better condition.
And wasn't that local option tax finally successful in voting that it wasn't before? They tried it before and then finally did get it, and wasn't most of it going to road use or road repair?
Well, there had been
a percentage.
There had been at least once and maybe twice that it was using the extra penny for flood recovery and roads was an option at least once previously. The voters did approve that extra penny for flood recovery, but when that was over, then the petition was sent to the voters to see if they would use all of that extra penny for road improvements, and that second time that it went through, it did pass.
And so all of that extra penny is going to road?
Correct.
Okay. How does the state work on its funding sources as compared to what Dave just explained, Kathy?
Right. We have the same kind of mechanism in as far as we gather taxes here at a statewide level. We also get a federal fuel tax sent to us. It's really about 50-50 of what we get. So our most recent, we program 5 years at a time, our programming is a little over $1 billion over those 5 years. And that's a combination of those state and federal taxes.
Okay. Mitch, from what they're talking, how does that sound to you as a player and participant from a Cedar Rapids citizen standpoint?
We were talking earlier about some of those challenges with the budget problems that we're having. Those dollars are decreasing in some ways, or being spread over a larger base, and so it is a challenge. Most of my work is in more of rural Iowa, and so not so much involvement with the city of Cedar Rapids, but we were talking earlier, the escalation of costs. Mm-hmm. The costs are growing faster than the revenues. And so it's creating problems for state and local level.
And one thing, we don't have a representative here with us this morning, but there's also the county part of this. And so they have responsibility outside, obviously, of Dave and the city limits. And if it's not designated a state highway, it's the only other one is county.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so as far as infrastructure, Dave, what about what we look at in Cedar Rapids in terms of, I know there's bridges, water, is there a city role? I think there was a state bridge team I read about in the paper recently that was in town.
Well, absolutely. Within the city, just as we talk about cooperative, there are jurisdictional roadways that we share with the DOT, but we have our own bridges. We have about 70 bridges that qualify as bridges under the federal definition of bridges. It's tied into the span. So some large culverts are considered bridges because they span over 20 feet. we have those 70, and we have to maintain those. And again, you mentioned the challenges. Costs continue to increase. The bridges, a lot of the bridges are old. We have paid a lot of attention to our bridges in the city. We do have some bridges that are in need of some repair. We use grants through the state Iowa Department of Transportation. We can sometimes get a grant to help repair or replace a bridge. But again, that's part of the challenge, and we do use the road use tax money and the local option sales tax money. Bridges are parts of the roadways, so those are funded out of that same pot of money.
And so anything such as a bridge or a road repair, they're all competing against that same source of road use monies for maintenance, isn't it?
Yes.
And so the needs are greater than the funding sources? Certainly?
Yes. And again, I did mention the road use tax and the federal gas tax. In Iowa, the gas tax is 21.4 cents a gallon, and I think it's been that for the last 23 years. And during those 23 years, the cost of concrete, the cost of labor, the cost of paving materials, the crushed rock aggregates and so forth has all gone up by a factor of 2 or 3 or even in some cases 4. Asphalt prices have kind of gone through the roof during that time frame. And unfortunately, even though people are driving more miles today because cars are getting better gas mileage, the revenues from those gas taxes have pretty much flatlined. So what we're seeing is those revenues at Cedar Rapids have been about $11 to $12 million for about the last decade. And during that time, concrete has gone up almost double. Asphalt has gone up almost triple. So our costs keep going up, but the revenues have stayed stagnant. So that's why I think eventually the voters did decide to approve that local option sales tax to supplement that gas tax. But long term, there has to be a better solution, because as we see more electric cars, as we continue to encourage people to ride bicycles and get out of their cars and walk, that revenue stream right now is not satisfying the needs of that infrastructure.
And Mitch, we here in Cedar Rapids economically have 2 pretty good-sized trucking companies between Westside and CRST, and then Heartland. Certainly, that's got to create a little bit more stress to the system. And does it make sense that that's why people are talking about this gas tax over in the legislature in Des Moines on whether they're going to do something about that?
We were talking about that earlier, that there's always give and take in these issues, but should the trucking companies have to pay more because of the wear on the roads? Very heavy vehicles, they do more road damage. But on the other hand, if the trucking companies if their rates are increased, then they're going to pass that on to the goods and services that they haul. Economics, it just goes around to, it's a pool of funding. So, on a user basis, should they be required? You can certainly make the case they should, because they definitely do more of the damage to the roads. But on the other hand, again, we're going to pay for it. The consumer's going to pay for it.
And Kathy, I mean, the state taxes the licensing of those trucks much more than you and I do in our personal cars. I mean, if I can't imagine those little stickers I see on the back of the truck that says this truck pays $14,000 a year in taxes. It's all up and down the scale, but they pay on that line of taxes, don't they?
They do, but a lot of it has not kept up with the modern times. And one of the things the governor has charged the DOT with is looking at different ways of gathering funding. For example, an overweight load needs a permit to come on the highways because they will damage the highways. Well, the cost of that permit for probably 30 years was $10. Well, that doesn't buy you very much roadway. So that was recently increased to $50, still not a huge amount, but at least that gets us more revenue coming in that we can then put to the roadways. So we are looking at a variety of options of coming up with funding strategies beyond just raising taxes.
Well, would that be instead of raising taxes, what you're doing is, it sounds more like you're trying to look for a fair share taxing methodology.
And perhaps more of a user base. So as you're using the system, then you would be taxed for that use of that system. So more a pay as you go. Okay.
And certainly, Iowa goes through a lot of difference between its manufactured goods and then its agricultural goods. And the thing that I've heard the Secretary of Agriculture say is that in the Cedar Rapids metro area, we go through 1 million bushels of corn a day between all of our facilities for ADM, ethanol, others. Dave, you know that's a lot of driving trucks across Cedar Rapids streets, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. We do have a lot of ag traffic coming in every single day to the various industries in Cedar Rapids. We have 3 Cargill plants. We have the ADM plant. We have the Penford facility. And they're bringing that raw material in on trucks and rail cars every single day. And we're keenly aware of the wear and tear that it's causing with the roadway system.
Okay. You bring up rail cars and another infrastructure. Who takes care of the rail coming through town? The people that own the tracks? Does the city get involved or the state get involved in any of that?
Well, we have over 200 railroad crossings, and unfortunately the railroad companies don't maintain that portion of the crossing for vehicular traffic. They maintain that portion of the crossing for their rail traffic. So there is a cooperative program that we have with those railroad companies. We actually have 4 operating railroad companies in Cedar Rapids. We also utilize the Iowa DOT grant program under their rail division to secure grants to help improve crossings and restore crossings, particularly on the high-speed roadways, the arterial network.
Okay. Any other infrastructure things that we should be talking that make our audience aware of things? Dams, we don't have any dam issues other than the 5 and 1. Are there any other dams that the city maintains?
Not that the city maintains.
The roller dam below
That's
River
an
Road?
Alliant Energy dam that they maintain.
Okay. And the city's only on for the 5 and 1?
We're just on the 5 and 1, yes.
We were talking about the sewer and water systems.
And the infrastructure there, the piping that was put in, now none of the bridges are considered dangerous, are they, of the number that you mentioned?
No, we go through bridge inspections. That's a federal mandate to inspect all bridges on a biennial basis. So every 2 years they get inspected. There's one bridge in Cedar Rapids that we are required to inspect every year because of the way it was designed. But we actually use the DOT on their snooper truck, which is a truck that has an arm that can reach down over the edge of the bridge and get people underneath it to make sure we do a good inspection on those bridges. As I mentioned, we have a couple of bridges that under that rating criteria would indicate there is a structural insufficiency, but not because it's going to fall down. It's because it just doesn't meet current standards. But it is, in some cases, we have weight limits on those bridges if that's the case. We've only have a couple bridges that right now are in need of more significant repairs. The rest of our bridges are in reasonable condition, but again, with that many bridges, it's an annual basis where we go through and have to review them, and every time we go through that review, there are defects that show up that we have to put in a capital improvements program and come up with a financial plan to get those things fixed.
Kathy, you're more road, aren't you? Are you aware, does Eastern Iowa have to be afraid of any bridge collapses or anything like in Minneapolis from a few years back?
No, certainly not,
terrorized?
because we do have that every 2-year bridge inspection on the same schedule. That's a federal mandate. So, and we're very careful with our bridges to maintain them in good shape. A couple of things we've done through 380 is work on the jointing through town. And just because of the amount of traffic, we do have to do that at night. So it does add a little bit extra cost because of the night work, the lighting, the things that people have to put about. But we do that for the safety of the traveling public.
I do have a compliment for you. I had a friend in from out of town, and they were highly complimentary of the 380 and coming through Cedar Rapids and how it looked and how smooth it traveled. So for the public that's not in the studio with us this morning, thank you very much for a good job.
Thank you, appreciate it.
And it makes Dave's job easier too.
It's a much nicer roadway.
Yeah, I have to tell Kathy, we get more compliments on 380 than we get on our own city streets because there's so much traffic on 380. They use it routinely, and when it was starting to get a little bit raveled, we got a lot of complaints. They don't the people in Cedar Rapids think to call us, not the DOT necessarily. We pass the comments on, but sometimes we don't pass the pat on the back on. We pass the complaints on because, you know, both they and us want to get out there and fix problems. If there's a pothole someplace or something that's dangerous, we want to get it fixed.
But in fact, I think it was council and yourself that were announcing that beginning this year, you've redoubled the repair efforts, and that's this year and next year. And so people want to see things immediately. They just have to realize how big the queue is, isn't it? It's huge.
Well, absolutely. There's a long list of projects and a long list of needs. With that approval of the local option sales tax, that's where we talked about doubling the amount of projects, and we rolled out what we called this summer a quick start program. Since the voters approved that in November, you know, normally we're planning projects 2 to even sometimes 3 years in advance. Because that was approved in November, we had to pick projects that we could very quickly implement. And of course, the other thing that we have to worry about in the city that maybe DOT doesn't have to worry about quite as much is we have buried utilities under our streets. So first and foremost, we have to make sure those utilities that are under there are in good condition, because we don't want to pave over a utility and then come in next year and tear up the street so we fix the utility. Okay. We coordinate that not only with our own sewer and water utilities, but we coordinate that with the franchise utilities, which include the power company and the gas company and the telecommunication companies.
And many times that's a multi-headed dragon to get everybody on the same place, at the same time with their assets to address those, isn't it?
That's why it can take 2 or 3 years. Those utility companies are not sitting there with money in the bank ready to replace a utility. When we come in and say we're going to do the street, then they say, well, you know, since you're doing the street now, we'll budget for our utility to get that fixed or replaced. So when you tear the street out, we'll replace our utility. It saves them the cost of tearing the street out and replacing it and patching it, and it saves us the wear and tear of having to worry about a utility patch occurring down the road. So we do a very diligent job of trying to coordinate all that. Now that doesn't mean that some utility line's not going to break anyway under the pavement someday, but we try to minimize that as much as possible.
And then everybody that says they want to have utility lines buried, that only makes it more complicated. They say they want to beautify it by removing all telephone poles. Well, you make it a more complex world beneath the streets when you put everything there.
Absolutely. Just another variable in the day-to-day work that we do to try to spend the taxpayers' money as wisely as possible.
Has there been, as far as infrastructure, has there been any impact that any of you can see from the Iowa wind power generation that's been happening? I mean, there's always a thing with the transmission of the power, and they're talking about where they're going to move lines across farmland. Is it affected Cedar Rapids or eastern Iowa very much? Either of you aware of any of that?
The only thing I know about really is the transportation of the huge blades.
Yeah.
That's been an issue, sometimes getting those the right way and make sure they're going on the right roads.
I remember the picture from a couple of years ago where the very first time one of those trucks tried to do it at the 80, I-80, or the 380-80 interchange, it just didn't make it.
It doesn't work.
You can't take that, what is that, the cloverleaf. That cloverleaf doesn't hack it. So, but they're still going down. What do they, just if you happen to know, what do they charge for the overweight, oversized one blade heading down the road? Is it $10?
That's at $50.
$50?
Wow.
Per long blade?
Per trip.
Okay, per trip, per blade.
Right.
Wow, okay. What about dams? Does Eastern Iowa need to be concerned about conditions of dams? I know everybody remembers the Lake Delhi from years ago, and there's been a big movement. The states, do we have a lot of dams that are in danger?
Not with our system, no.
No? Okay. We've got a couple minutes left. Dave, what can the Eastern Iowa people expect to see happen in the next 2 years in Cedar Rapids? You've already stated the repair and everything's going to be double on streets. What other infrastructure improvements have been in the planning?
Well, we have an ongoing program of fixing the sanitary sewers. We do have, in June we had some flash flood events. So we have 2 types of sewers that we deal with in the city of Cedar Rapids. One's the sanitary sewer that takes the wastewater down to our wastewater plant for treatment and then discharge. But the other component is the stormwater that runs off from parking lots and from buildings and roofs and so forth. We try to keep that stormwater out of the sanitary system because the sanitary system is only designed to handle the wastewater, not the stormwater. But we do have some issues where when the ground gets very saturated, basement leakage and foundation drain connections to that sanitary system overload that system. So we're going to work on disconnecting those sources and trying to avoid having that sanitary system getting flooded when we have saturated ground conditions and heavy rains. The other thing that's ongoing is our water main system that provides that potable water to people. We try to coordinate those main replacements when we do the paving projects, and we'll continue to do that. And then probably the more major infrastructure element that kind of is a category by itself is the flood mitigation system. We're going to spend, with the state grant that we received through the flood mitigation program that the state adopted a couple years ago, we're going to construct about a $500 million flood protection system on both sides of the river in Cedar Rapids.
And so I guess when you talk to an audience like would be watching our show this morning, when you talk about trying to prevent bad things from floods, it shouldn't have to be too hard to convince them that bad things can happen.
Well,
Certainly
sure,
not.
and that's why the interest is getting a flood protection system built to protect the downtown on the east side and on the west side to protect the growth that's occurred there and the businesses that are there. And to encourage more growth down closer to the river. And the only way you can really do that and really reduce that risk of flooding that would eventually destroy all that is build a flood protection system. And the goal is to build it so it's transparent, so it doesn't look like a flood protection system. That means there will be some removable walls, like in the amphitheater area. That'll be something that is designed to be an amenity rather than just a flood berm sitting there by itself.
As I understand it, at least currently, that the only FEMA assistance is going to come to the east side on the construction there. The city has to find other sources for the west because it doesn't meet the FEMA formula, so to speak.
Yeah, and
so,
it's actually the FEMA is not the funding agency, it's the federal government. I mean, FEMA is an agency of the federal government.
But it was the test that they applied.
Yeah, this is the Corps of Engineers program, so it comes through the Corps of Engineers.
Okay.
They determined it met the federal interest on the east side only. That doesn't mean that...
That's okay. That's the point I wanted to make for our public to understand that. Kathy, any final last little wrap-up comment to our viewing audience this morning?
Well, we're sure excited about Highway 100 and getting that completed. Just want to let people know we are kind of moving into a stewardship role as far as the rest of the roadways, so there won't be too many new 4-lane highways coming anymore. We really are going to be focused on maintaining the system we have.
Mitch, you've been real talkative this morning. Any wrap-up comment on expectations, what we can look for and see?
No, to comment earlier, we have a lot to be thankful for. Our situation here is so much better than many parts of the country. We have a great state and local government. They do a great job with the funds that we provide to them. So,
good enough. Thank you for joining me this morning, and to all our viewers, please go out and have a great day today and help make our community a better place to live now and in the future for our children. Thank you for joining us. And there it goes.